Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Giles Keating to the podcast to talk about the history of the very stunning Athelhampton House in Dorset. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Giles. How are you?
Very well, Natalie. Delighted to be here.
Oh, I'm really excited to talk to you about your magnificent home. So before we dive into that, would you mind just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background?
By all means, yes. So Giles Keating, and I own Athelhampton House in Dorset, a wonderful Tudor house. And I became the owner, or perhaps I should say custodian. I think that's a better phrase, rather over 5 years now, and quite a tumultuous 5 years with COVID starting almost straight away. And before I came to Athelhampton, I worked as an economist for many years, sort of analysing the world economy, seeing what was going on, talking to people all around the world. And in some ways, I find that coming to Athelhampton carries on with that because we have so many visitors from all around the world.
Absolutely. And I was actually lucky to visit, I think it was last year, and it's an absolutely magnificent Tudor property. So I highly recommend it to anyone who's ever in the area. And can you tell us a little bit about the history of the house?
By all means, yes. So its origins go back at least to Anglo-Saxon times, mentioned in the Domesday Book and so on. But the present house was actually built around about 1485 or just afterwards. So really right at the start of the Tudor era. And it was built by Sir William Martin, who was one of the Norman families who'd come over to England with William the Conqueror. His descendants had, I should say, or his ancestors had. And he, I think, faintly at the last minute, moved across to Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field and was then rewarded with a royal warrant, which allowed him to castellate, to kind of reinforce with battlements the house he was building and to enclose his deer park. And he built this beautiful great hall and the surrounding wings. And then the house was extended in the middle of the Tudor era. We can discuss that a bit more. And then towards the end of the Tudor era, there was this almost traumatic thing where there were no male descendants. And so the then owner, Sir Nicholas Martin, decided to divide the house among his 4 daughters. I think rather a wonderful thing, actually, rather than just handing it off to a kind of, some distant male relative. So that's the kind of the Tudor era. And it's really, well, perhaps we'll talk about that. It's really not so very different nowadays.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned the Martin family, so they're the owners in the 16th century. Do we know very much about them? Did they have positions at court, for example, or any other sort of details about them?
Well, they were involved. We know quite a lot. Yes, I would say first and foremost, they were local landowners, and they were pretty big in the kind of Dorset, Wessex area, and they got marriage alliances with many of the great families there. So Sir William, for example, his family symbol is the ape, and we see the ape, who's a kind of medieval character. But we also see the unicorn, which was the family symbol of the lady he married, Isabel Farringdon. And so you've got this wonderful unicorn with the horn there as well. So as for court, well, they had quite a lot of connections with royalty, but some of them were good, some of them were not so good. So Sir William actually went to greet Catherine of Aragon when she arrived in England for the first time. He was one of the knights who kind of accompanied her on the way to the royal court. And we think he may well have, because it was Athelhampton was kind of halfway along the route, he may well have invited her to come and stay. So that was all pretty good. And then a bit later on, the family entered into another marriage alliance with a gentleman called Sir John Tregonwell, who was a right-hand man of Thomas Cromwell and who was responsible for the dissolution of the monasteries across the southwest and made an awful lot of money out of that. But unlike Sir Thomas, he didn't get his head chopped off. He was a very smart operator across all the different Tudor kings and queens. The Martins were a Catholic family. They didn't change. And so, of course, that was fine during Mary's era, but then under Elizabeth, that became quite sticky. And they were, I think they kind of played it quite well. Sir Nicholas Martin, who I mentioned in the later part of Elizabeth's era, became the sheriff. But one of his 4 daughters did marry a gentleman called Chidiock Tichborne, who was one of the Babington plotters who tried to kill Queen Elizabeth, and I'm afraid got executed. So that was a perhaps less comfortable relationship with court.
Certainly is a lot of history connected to the house. Now, I believe that your Tudor novels that you've written, very excitingly, were inspired by the story of this family. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about your books?
Oh, by all means, yes. Well, as you can tell, I've been did quite a lot, ma'am, and doing a lot of research on this. And I just thought that the whole story, particularly about those 4 daughters, it just cried out to be turned into a novel. And then I learned that there were local feuds. So they were having a feud with one of their cousins. There was actually a pitched battle over a barn. And so really the story evolved with the youngest daughter, Anne, aged about 12, and pressure on her to get married, and possibly even in a way she really didn't want at all. And so that was very much inspired by being a rich heiress that everybody wanted to marry. And I felt it was quite a modern theme of a young woman or girl on the brink of womanhood who wasn't, was being rather pushed around, if you like, into a direction she didn't want, and how she could fight against that. And then to add a bit of further interest and excitement, I drew in all these stories of these amazing local pirates who really did ply the Dorset coast. And fascinatingly, there was one in particular who brought back ape as presents for people. And then I learned that there was a young girl at Athelhampton who had an ape as a pet. And there is a story that the ape rather sadly got trapped behind the panelling. And so again, that all, as you can see, these ideas begin to draw together into the stories.
So how many novels have you written to date?
Well, so I've written so far 2 novels, and I've been talking mainly about the first one, and that's Anne of Athelhampton and the Riddle of the Apes. And then the second novel, Anne of Athelhampton and the Queen's Pearls. Now, that's more about the Babington plot and about Chidiock Tichborne, who, of course, in the book is the husband of one of Anne's older sisters. And so Anne begins to investigate what he's up to. And she begins to understand that perhaps what he's doing is not very sensible. And so she tries to find ways to kind of save him from his own foolishness, if you like. And she is quite successful up to a point, as you'll see, although, of course, we have to stick with the historical realities there as well.
But you've got a lot to work with, don't you?
Absolutely, I do, yes. And so then there's a third novel in preparation, which will complete the trilogy, but that's still a bit on the building blocks at the moment.
Oh, lovely. And so if our listeners want to have a look at those or purchase those, where could they go?
So they're all available on Amazon, and they're on print on demand, so they can just be immediately delivered as a nice paperback or as an ebook. And in fact, the first one is available as an audiobook as well.
Oh, that's really good. That's really handy. I know people really like those. So let's go back to the house, talk a little bit more about Athelhampton House. Has it undergone many alterations over the centuries? And maybe you could also tell us about some of the Tudor features that survive.
By all means, yes. So I think one of the wonderful things is that much of it is quite extraordinarily original as a Tudor house. And so the heart of the house is the amazing great hall, sort of wonderful kind of double height with a minstrel's gallery, of course, and a great fireplace, and amazing stained glass, which have got the arms in them, the coats of arms of the Martin family and the various families that they married into. So that's the heart of the house. And I think we could say that's pretty much as it would have been in Tudor times. And we often sit in there and have a meal by the blazing fire, just as might have happened before. And then leading off from that, you've got rooms, some of which are again very much so one would call the marriage chamber, with a beautiful four-poster bed and the paneling, and again the family symbols of the ape and the unicorn in stone above the fireplace. All of that very original. And then leading off another way, we've got what I jokingly call the modern extension, which is the one built about 60 years after the Battle of Bosworth, so built in about something like 1560, probably with some of the money from that gentleman, Sir John Tregonwell, who got it from the monasteries, because his arms feature very heavily in the walls there. And so the great chamber there, where Sir Nicholas would have been the sheriff and would have handed out justice, local justice, that's again really fairly original kind of room. So I think there's a lot to feel there that's pretty original. And then, of course, there have been some changes, and there have been different owners over the years. And for example, we've got one room laid out in the 1930s style with Art Deco furniture because of the wife of one of the press barons who lived there for a while, and Noel Coward came to visit, and so on. So there's a bit of variety alongside the Tudor.
And so I imagine that it must be just so wonderful owning a house like Athelhampton, but there's probably some challenges associated with a house that's, 500 years old. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's like, and what are the challenges owning or being a custodian of such a house?
Well, indeed, I would say, first of all, is welcoming all our visitors, which is wonderful. We welcome about 30,000 visitors a year, but just looking after them, of course, is a major undertaking. Everything through from making sure that the routes through the house are all clear, but everything's safe, and looking after all the catering for them, all of these kind of things. So that's one challenge, is looking after the general public and obviously marketing and making sure people know when we've got special events. And then obviously looking after the fabric. It's just an ongoing challenge. And we're very lucky that, for example, the roof has been incredibly well looked after. That's always one of the key parts of a house like that, as you can imagine. And one of the things we've done, which may sound a bit extraordinary, but we've actually installed a very, very modern heating system, which is all renewable energy with solar panels, of course, well away from the house. You can't see them unless you kind of walk across a field, and then kind of underground pipes. So you can't see any of it. But the joy of that is another problem that many houses has if they get pretty cold and damp, and that's really bad for the fabric. We're very lucky with this system that it actually keeps it at a nice, even temperature through this kind of invisible heating system. So that's yet another issue. And then I would say finally is just you have to deal with who knows how many authorities, whether people who are worried about bats or finance or whatever. So or the river that goes by, there's always a new regulation to cope with.
I can just imagine, yes. And so what is it that you love most about being the custodian of Athelhampton?
I think on the one hand, it is talking to the visitors, and it's just tremendous when people come along and say how much they enjoyed being there, or perhaps they have something they want to change. But that's always lovely. And then I think the other thing is perhaps of an evening when the visitors have gone home, just to perhaps with a sort of friends and family, occasionally just by myself, just to perhaps prepare a meal. We've now got the Elizabethan kitchen. I haven't talked about that, but that's been completely restored. It was all hidden, and we've revealed the whole of the great arch there. And then we've got a modern kitchen sort of right next door to that. So preparing a meal there, and then getting the fire going in the great hall as the darkness comes down, and just sitting there perhaps with a glass of Tudor wine, and just absolutely wonderful.
Oh, it sounds so atmospheric. And I'm just I imagine that Christmas is a lovely time at the hall. I haven't visited at that point, but do you have a family gathering in that amazing great hall?
So our family gatherings, one way or the other, have worked out to be New Year's. So a few days later. And yes, we've had big groups there and playing whatever board games, or people even, in fact, one of my sons organized a kind of sort of haunted house detective story type thing as well, with people in costume, which was rather fun.
Oh, that does sound fun. Yes, I can just imagine, just with candles on and at night, it must be pretty atmospheric. And I have to say, Giles, that the first time I came across Athelhampton House was many, many, many years ago, before actually I started the podcast and my work in Tudor history, and it was on Most Haunted. I don't know if any of my listeners remember the program, but they did in fact visit the house. So I know there's been lots of stories and it's reputedly quite haunted. Tell us a little bit about this kind of haunted history that goes with the house, and of course, whether you've ever had any spooky experiences there.
Well, astonishingly, Athelhampton, I think, was the number one program on the Most Haunted series. Rather extraordinary. So there are a number of stories, yes. And I did mention to you the ape who was the pet of the little girl. And the story, very sadly, is that the girl was kind of, disappointed in love, and she went behind the paneling with her ape. And I think she may have escaped, but the ape got trapped and died there. But people say they do see the ape appear and wander through the corridors. So that's one of the ghosts. And then there is also meant to be a grey lady who appears, who had some great sadness there. And we do know there was something slightly dodgy that went on in the sort of 17th, 18th century with some lady who kind of died in slightly mysterious circumstances. So that might be who that is. People say there is a duel between a Civil War pair, a cavalier and a roundhead, in the Great Chamber. And then they also say that there is the sound of a cooper, the man who makes the barrels. Apparently you can hear a kind of tap, tap, tap going on in the cellar some of the time. But now I've been there, and the house feels very lived in, even if there's nobody else there. So I feel a kind of good feeling there. But it is interesting that we have somebody who acts as a guardian when there's no one else in the house. And one night he was sitting in the Elizabethan kitchen, and the door to that kitchen is very, very stiff. And he was just sitting there looking on his tablet or whatever, and he got his mobile phone. And quite suddenly, this door, which you have to kind of really pull quite hard to open, it just flew open of its own accord. The lights all went out. His mobile phone and his tablet went off, and he really could feel something was going on. And so he hurried off to another room in the house and found another computer and reconnected with the people who he'd been talking to. They said, what happened? And he said, well, something pretty mysterious there. So, but I think he's obviously very tuned in to these things. I don't think it was really bad, but there was something going on there.
That does sound interesting. And I'm sure that all our listeners now are wanting to put Athelhampton House on their to-visit list. So when is the home open to the public?
Well, almost every day of the year. We close only for about 10 days, maybe not even that much, across the Christmas New Year period, just to give, obviously, the team a rest. But no, pretty well every day, except maybe, 3 days before Christmas, and then open just after New Year. Sometimes I think we might even open a couple of days in between this year. So almost any time. And we open, I think the gardens typically open about 10 o'clock, slightly earlier, and the house at 11, and then through until about 4 for the house, 5 for the gardens. So no, we love to have people come along, and yeah, very much open. Yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful, because I know some other houses are difficult to get to because they have such short opening times. So that's really wonderful. I can't let you go, though, just yet. I have another thing that I like to do with my guests when they're first on Talking Tudors, and that's what I like to call 10 to go. So these are just 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one, apart from Athelhampton, what's another favourite historic site that you like to visit?
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, I think we could certainly say Hampton Court, and the kitchens there are a kind of very big, the kind of big brother of the ones that we've got. And I was very lucky to be given a tour where we even went on the roof of Hampton Court, a sort of special tour. So that's a very exciting place.
Oh, that is very special. Not everyone gets to do that, so you're very lucky. What about a favorite, either a favorite book or the last book that you read?
Well, now that is very interesting. So actually, at the moment, I am just reading a book called The Queens and the Hive by Edith Sitwell, which is it's quite an old book now, probably about half a century old, but it's very much throughout the Tudor era. And she has a slightly perhaps old-fashioned style, but I think writes rather wonderfully.
And you've said that you're a writer as well. So do you have any particular writing rituals that you like to follow?
Well, that's a very interesting one. I mean, I do like, I think, to write a first draft really pretty swiftly and kind of get things down, and then perhaps come back and then do revisions and edits afterwards. But as for kind of time of day and that sort of thing, I mean, it's just a matter of, to be honest, fitting it in when you can around 1,000,001 other things.
I can imagine exactly looking after that property. So what about a new skill that you might like to learn if you had some more spare time?
Well, that's very interesting. And in fact, I have been trying to acquire an understanding of poetry, believe it or not. And that's associated with another person who's linked to another Athelhampton link, which is Thomas Hardy, obviously the author, but also a very prolific poet. And so we've been doing a lot of work on his poetry. And I just felt embarrassed that I knew so little about the structure of poems and the various devices that people use. So I've been trying to go up the learning curve on that a bit. And I'd recommend it to anyone. It's a whole new world. Many listeners already understand poetry very well, but I hardly knew at all.
What about a travel destination somewhere maybe that you haven't been that you would like to visit?
Wow. Well, I mean, I'm lucky enough to have visited quite a lot of places, but where could we suggest would be quite exciting? I mean, I have never been to New Zealand, so that could be a lovely place to come to. So put that on the bucket list, definitely. Yes.
Wonderful. And it is stunning, absolutely stunning, New Zealand, especially the South Island. I think it's particularly picturesque. And what about a favourite season? Is there any season that you prefer and why?
Oh, I mean, I think spring has to be it, doesn't it? Just everything bursting out, the gardens looking wonderful, just the whole sense of promise after the long, deep winter. And, which is not to say that I don't love the autumn colours of autumn leaves and so on, and the long days of summer. But spring, it's just so full of that beginning, and just fabulous.
And I imagine with your gardens that you have there, you'd quite enjoy walking around the gardens and enjoying that. And what about an ideal Sunday morning? What might that look like for you?
I think it definitely involves a nice cup of coffee, sitting around, having a little bit of a chat with people, maybe a little bit of a small pastry or something like that. That sort of wonderful moment, kind of you've got up and then you've just got this little gap where there's nothing really urgent to do, just perfect. That doing that sort of doing something but doing nothing, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. And the last question for you, you obviously have a lot on your plate. What do you like to do to try to just relax and unwind a little bit?
I do try and do quite a bit of yoga, actually. That's really a real favourite, and it relaxing, although depending on who's taking the class, sometimes it can also be quite a little bit of toughness as well, but that's a nice combination.
Oh, that sounds lovely. And the very last thing is our Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway, something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Well, indeed, yes. So if I can suggest the Athelhampton YouTube channel, and it's what I might call a young channel. At the moment, we've only got 3 videos up there, but I think your readers your listeners might be interested in all of those. One of them is indeed around the ghosts theme that we talked about. One of them is about royalty connections with Athelhampton. And one is a rather special, very short, but it's about opening up a Tudor, well, it's actually post-Tudor, but it's from the Tudor, it relates to the Tudor era, a chest with amazing locking system. And we're going to add more videos, including some of our Tudor recreations that we do, where we have people who come along in Tudor costume and they do Tudor cooking and so on. So yes, and it's just the athelhampton.com YouTube site. So I think you can find it very easily. And yeah, do please use that as a lovely internet resource.
Oh, well, that sounds wonderful. I'm going to check that out as soon as we're done talking here. And I will add the links to the website for your wonderful house and to the YouTube channel to our show notes so that everyone can just find it really easily. Giles, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and talking Tudors with us.
A real pleasure.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.